YouTube, welcome back. Just wanted to do a quick video on my latest triumph on the Cockshutt 40 rebuild. Many have pointed out that in the video I posted a couple of weeks back on my first start and first drive, it was apparent that my power steering wasn't working, and you are completely right. So I had to do a little bit of work here over the holiday break to try to troubleshoot that. But I ended up finally fixing it, so I'll kind of walk you through that. Basically, this came equipped with a Vickers hydraulic pump. So it's a vane type hydraulic pump, and it's accessory driven, and what they call a torque generator. So that's basically it's like a version of an inline motor, but it has a valve. It has a valve body on the inside of it, and in that valve body there's a torsion bar, really similar to like a valve setup on a modern rack and pinion hydraulic steering. And then in the second section there's a gear rotor. So what happens is when you twist the steering wheel, if you put enough torque into it, that torsion bar will crack an internal valve, and that basically what that does is it'll allow oil to port into the gear rotor and give you fluid power in the direction that you're rotating, right? So it's torque sensitive. So it's a pretty ingenious little deal. This is a newer Eaton pump. I have an old one. I have an old S102, which is I'd say kind of the original version of that. But I got a new one just because I don't want to fool around with it anymore. The old one's got some bugs to work out. It still works, but I got some bugs to work out with it, and I said to hell with it, because I wanted power steering like right now. So that's the business end, right? But that gets powered by a hydraulic source, and in this case we're using this vane type hydraulic pump. What I found in the original one was it was in real bad shape. It was leaking like basically from everywhere. But more to the point, there's a whole slew of other things that I needed. Number one, the reservoir it came with was too tall. It would build pressure, but it had issues with flow. Like it wasn't flowing nearly the GPM that I needed it to flow in order to power that bad dude. So it basically acted like a dead pump. I won't go into the troubleshooting of that. Maybe I'll save that for another video. But if you've ever worked on a hydraulic system before, the troubleshooting it's a little bit ambiguous. So I'll leave it at that. But essentially what I ended up doing was, because they don't make parts for these pumps anymore, they do make certain parts. So what they call the cartridge, which is actually the rotor assembly, the vanes in the rotor, and this ring, they call that a ring plate. So the pump, basically the pump portion of it, they do make remanufactured versions of. But as far as the seals and the gaskets and the control valve and all the other stuff, they don't make them anymore. So the good news is that these were really popular like in the early 50s, and they were used on a lot of stuff. So they used them on cars, trucks, tractors, agricultural equipment, fork trucks, you name it. So the neatest part is that you can go on eBay and there's people just literally throwing this stuff out. So you can get your hands on these. These can be had very easily. And the cool part is they're all interchangeable. So this one right here came out of a Fordson. You notice it's got Vickers stamped into it. But this one came out of a Buick, and they look oddly similar. But this one's got Saginaw stamped onto it. So believe it or not, they're the same thing. So the cool part is all the parts in these are interchangeable, and depending on the configuration you have, so these are flow controlled and they have pressure relief. Depending on the configuration you have between this cover and the flow control valve, you can basically get anywhere from like 1.5 GPM all the way up to 5 GPM, which is a pretty neat feature. So if this was on a tractor that peaks out at 1600 RPM, they've got a build for that. If it goes onto a car that's going to drive at 5000 RPM, they've got a build for that. And it's just by switching out some of these common core parts. Again, brilliant design. This one's a lot heavier than what you'll see on a typical power steering setup, you know, like a conventional, like a modern day pump. These weigh about 20 pounds because, you know, they're all cast iron, so they're beefy little mofos. But these are the model that they call a VT16 or a VT17. They're essentially the same. The only difference between a 16 and 17 is that the 16 has the integral reservoir and the 17 has a port block. So it has a threaded port. So if you want to run a remote reservoir, that's the only difference. So it's the VT16, 17 100 series pump. They go between 1.5 to 5 gallons per minute. And they essentially, there's a flow control valve that's on the inside of this that is essentially how you choose how much output this has. There's a lot more to it than that, but basically for a given speed, this ring will put out has a certain capacity. So you have a usable capacity there, and anything that's not used. So these are I'll say this: these are made for open center setups. So any of the fluid that's not being used by the load ends up, this flow control opens up and it allows fluid to just go back to tank. So when it's not, basically when it doesn't have demand from the load, it's just constantly recirculating fluid. These are nice also because that valve has a pressure relief in it as well. So if you are in a situation where you have, well, we'll say dynamic feedback in the system at the load, so that would usually be like if you get stuck in ruts and your steering is working really hard, you need a lot of, it builds up a lot of pressure because of the restriction. Or let's say you hit a steering stop, you know, and you hear the pump, normally you'll hear the pump whine like real hard or maybe even trip the belt. What keeps this from blowing a hose off is that there's a pressure relief in there, and that's factory set for 5 or 6 different values. So again, the cool part is if you've amassed a collection of these like I have, you can literally Frankenstein any kind of pump you want based on your application. So those are pretty neat. I think I'll do a video of the teardown on these because they are pretty cool, really simple. But essentially what I ended up doing was everything that you see in red was kind of the parts on my original one that I didn't want anymore or found to be unusable or unworkable. So I got all my Franken parts hooked up on this guy, threw some ATF in it, and instantaneously when you start with the tractor, it works like a champ. So I'm super happy about that. I'll take a cut and I'll just show you a startup. This thing works incredibly well, and when I say that, your hand torque, at least with this guy installed, so if you have the engine off and you're not flowing fluid to it, if you don't have any fluid power, this will actually add torque to what you would normally, the mechanical advantage you have through your steering system, just by the nature of how the gear rotor set up in here. But you can't for the life of you, I mean, you could be like He-Man and you can't get this thing to turn unless you have a little bit of motion in the wheels. Like if you're just sitting here on the floor, you could totally try to beefcake that wheel, and that's like a freaking bus steering wheel, right? You can try to totally beefcake that into submission, but it just ain't gonna happen. When you have a little bit of motion in the tractor, it helps. It's no different than manual steering on an old muscle car or something. But essentially, what I'll show you here is when I cut to the video, I can't yak at you anymore because it's going to be too loud. But you'll be able to see, like, literally with one finger, you can turn this steering. All right, so the output of this is phenomenal. All right, so I'll cut to that, and then I'll talk at you later. If you're interested in this stuff, drop me a note, whatever, and I'll do a separate video on how to rebuild these, and then maybe also on how to rebuild one of these torque generators too. All right, thanks YouTube. Talk to you later. All right, I'm up on the tractor now, and this is the mother of all difficult camera angles. But I think what you'll be able to see is, like right now, I can take the slop out of it, but I can't. I can barely get those wheels to budge. Now I'll admit I am no He-Man, but like there's a lot of weight on that front axle. Okay, so you ain't moving it. So what the advantage of power steering is. Turn the key on, dork. One finger. That's a beautiful thing.